I'm primarily a writer and a grower of food. I'm not really a theologian. I'm kind of a hack theologian. I know just enough to be dangerous. So I approach these things more as a writer and as a practitioner. And what I want to talk about in this hour is a subject that is one that I don't think we've really begun to grapple with as a church, as a society, and that's the issue of climate change. And the way I want to talk about that is through a short essay. And so I'm not going to, just to give you forewarning, I'm not going to badger you with statistics. I think we've all been beaten over the head enough with statistics and numbers. They're useful, but they're not, in the end, going to transform us. And I think what we need is to be transformed. So I want to approach this just first as a father, as a fellow believer, as a grower of food, thinking through the ways that climate change impacts agriculture, and I'm doing so through the medium of this little essay. So think of this essay is probably about 15 minutes long. So this, you guys remember kindergarten? Yeah. This is like the after lunch hour when I'm gonna read to you a little story, right? But you can't go to sleep, okay? Don't go to sleep. Nap time comes later. I'm going to read you a little story, and then I want to talk about it with you, and we'll break up into groups and then have a conversation. So if you find yourself drifting off, just, your neighbor will be there to nudge you. This essay is called "The Sons of Noah," and I think the title will become clear as I proceed. But I'm thinking of this. I'm addressing artists in here, but I'm addressing really your inner artists. So you all are artists of some sort. So don't think, oh, I don't paint or something like that. I want you to all see yourselves in this when I say the word artist. The Sons of Noah. In Williamstown, Kentucky, 600 miles from the sea, Ken Ham is building an ark. This is a true story, I should say, before I begin. This is not a short story, fiction. This is a true story. Ken Ham is building an ark. No scaled-down museum model, this ark will be a museum unto itself, the first full-sized replica of Noah's original. Upon completion in 2016, the Ark Encounter, as it's called, will be the largest timber frame structure in the country. Its dimensions, 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, come straight from the blueprint found in Genesis. And here, blueprint describes both the construction plan and the hermeneutic. The lifting of these exact numbers from the Bible follows from Mr. Ham's and his fellow creationist preference for reading Scripture literally. Any man who would build an ark, understand the creation of the world, or intuit God's will for mankind, and it is mankind for Ken Ham and his colleagues, can discover in the Bible the only blueprint he will ever need. As one of the world's leading spokesmen for creationist theology, Ken Ham is a young earth enthusiast. And his passion for convincing others that the world is only 6,000 years old has delivered him a tiny empire. Ham is the CEO of an outfit called Answers in Genesis, creators of the Creation Museum in nearby Petersburg, Kentucky, and the organization that's building the Ark Encounter. Ham has already raised half of the $30 million needed for this project, which is more than just an ark. Next door, he plans to build a live petting zoo with 2 of every kind. And the plans for phase 2 include, in what I suspect escapes Mr. Ham's sense of irony, a full-scale Tower of Babel. I have not begun to see the ark in progress, although it's already underway. When I first read about it, I thought the guy was completely nuts. And it would appear that I'm not alone. The media consensus outside the creationist circle is that Mr. Ham is not just building an ark, he's building a 300 cubit target for our collective scorn and derision. How easy to point out the hubris, the excess, the spectacular lunacy of the whole Genesis theme park jamboree. But lately, maybe it's because I've been praying the Lenten prayer of St. Ephrem. Yea, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own transgressions and not to judge my brother. That my attitude toward Mr. Ham, my brother, has softened. I want to suggest that Mr. Ham has actually given us all a rare and precious gift. For what is the Ark Encounter, if not a perfect metaphor for climate change? Or rather, a perfect metaphor for our collective response or lack thereof to climate change. You see, all around us, the oceans are rising with a literalness that cares not a whit for whatever we happen to believe about it. By century's end, if the atmosphere warms by the predicted 4 degrees Celsius, assuming we do nothing, the sea threatens to flood up to 2/3 of the world's coastal cities, to cite only one of many projected catastrophes. We are entering a new Diluvian Age, which we ourselves have created. Meanwhile, 600 miles from the sea, the bulldozers in Kentucky are clearing ground for an ark, symbol of salvation from the rising waters, an ark that will not float. So I want to just pause here and just let that image linger. A full-scale timber frame ark. Over the coming century, humanity's poised to relive the Noah story all over again. The waters really are rising, except this time it's not God causing the flood, it's us. And what are we doing? We're building this grand edifice, right, that just has absolutely nothing to do with the actual reality of the situation. Now, granted, Ken Ham is a climate change denier, so he's building it for his own purposes. He doesn't think this has anything to do with climate change. But I think we can think of this image as our failed collective response thus far to respond to the actual rising of the waters. There's a great piece by Elizabeth Colbert in a recent New Yorker on sending people to Mars. And she kind of ends the piece by asking the question, why are we so desperate to get to other planets? Could it be that we haven't really learned to look after this one, and so we're eager to escape? I think this is part of what Norman was talking about earlier. But we're pumping all this money into trying to go to Mars or building arks when we really need to be dealing with the reality of what we're facing with climate change. I want to come back to Ken Ham and his ark shortly. But first I want to talk about how we know things. There are many ways of knowing. When it comes to understanding the workings of things like our atmosphere, I trust a scientific way of knowing. I once interviewed the plant geneticist Wes Jackson, the winner of the Right Livelihood Award, for his work developing perennial grains. Wes is one of the grandfathers of the sustainable agriculture movement. I asked Wes about climate change. 97% of the world's climate scientists have reached a consensus that A, climate change is happening, and B, humans are the prime agents. Now, they quibble about just how much certain actions of ours affect certain results, but there's widespread agreement, 97% agreement, that humans are the prime cause. Okay? I asked Wes about that, and I said, what about the 3% who challenged the consensus? Scientists score points by discrediting their peers, Wes told me. That's a big part of their modus operandi. So when you get a consensus among scientists, it's pretty hard won. We don't know how researchers discovered that insulin is secreted by the pancreas, Wes told me. How can we be sure insulin doesn't come from the femur? Right? Has anybody really investigated that? I mean, what if it came from the femur? We don't know. But we trust people who have investigated that. Wes said, he told me about a tenured professor at Berkeley who does not think that the HIV virus causes AIDS. The professor has solid data to back up his hypothesis. He's a tenured professor at Berkeley. Most of us, Wes said, know nothing about the connection between HIV and AIDS, but we trust the scientific consensus. The Berkeley professor may have something to say, Wes said, but that doesn't mean I'm going to accept a blood transfusion from someone with HIV positive. The scientific way of knowing, he said, can describe astonishing things like the pancreas secretes insulin, HIV causes AIDS, the Arctic sea ice will be gone by 2030. Science is very good at describing those things, and we should pay attention to them. But when science points to Homo sapiens as the prime warmer of our world, it's worth asking why that same science is so powerless to make us change. Okay, so we know that science is telling us what's happening with very pointed accuracy. But what I want to now talk about is why that same science can't then cause us to change. When it comes to curtailing climate change, most of us suspect by now that tithing our mint and cumin isn't adding up. Driving a Prius, dutiful recycling, these will not stop the waters from rising. Real change can only come if the leviathans of industry are hobbled. If we curtail our carbon habit on a planetary scale, and that will take laws, a process we suspect will be messy and time-consuming and largely beyond our control as individual citizens. And so knowing this, many of us have traveled quickly along a continuum from dismay to fear to a kind of blasé acceptance of our own powerlessness. Apathy creeps in, and despair slinks close behind. And I've been guilty of the sin of despair at times. Our emotional and spiritual capacity to reckon with our own propensity for destruction has yet to catch up with our technological power to destroy. The underlying assumption of science is that if we only have enough time, research, and grant funding, we can figure out this ecosystem, this cancer, this cosmos. In confronting climate change, science can propose carbon sequestration techniques for mitigation, recommend policy changes. But what science cannot do is move the human spirit to act. Science cannot reach with delicacy and grace into the bowels of our innermost being and make us yearn or ache or tell us, as the poet Rainer Maria Rilke tells us, you must change your life. As one who writes about nature, quote unquote, I consider myself part of the environmental movement. We need movements. I marched in New York alongside 400,000 people last September to demand that our governments act on climate change. And I believe our actions added up to more than just mere protests. Yet I've grown uneasy with how we speak of our ecological crisis. I've begun to wonder if we should abandon altogether this thing called, quote, the environmental movement, because it makes us think there's some separate thing called the environment that some of us can worry about, while the rest of us kind of get on with whatever else we plan to do. It allows too many people off the hook to have a separate environmental movement. The environmental movement hasn't made this easy. Early on, they've ratcheted up their language to the level of shrill. and there it has more or less stayed. But the hyperbolic, shrill rhetoric of the environmental movement is hard to sustain for very long. The ever-present sense of ecological urgency only serves to numb us. And after a decade or so of getting emails implying that the world will end if I don't click this link or call this senator or demand this policy change, I just quit reading them. I just delete those emails. Maybe it's the end of the world as we know it, but do we really need to keep tweeting about it? Even as I point out such failures of language, I'm conscious of my own. How alluring it is to slip into that tone of casual irony, world-weary and glib, that simply assumes apocalypse. Who among us can really conceive it possible, let alone bear the weight such knowledge brings, that we are changing the very dome above the waters that God created and called very good? We're changing that. If the urgent email updates or environmental action plans aren't going to motivate us, then what will? This is why I think we need artists and writers like we've never needed them before. And maybe it's just because I'm a writer, I have to admit my own little bias there. But I think we need a language, a way of seeing that will take full account of our role as imago Dei, the image of God, created from ruach and adamah, breath and soil. We need a language that recognizes both our godlikeness and our propensity for destruction. There's a line from one of Wendell Berry's poems, and you can't get through a talk like this without quoting the gospel according to Wendell. But there's a little 2 lines from one of his poems. He says, "My purpose is a language that can make us whole." But he immediately undercuts that and says, "Though mortal, ignorant, and small." My purpose is a language that can make us whole, though mortal, ignorant, and small. Berry reaches for wholeness, but he qualifies it. I read in Berry and writers like him, Jane Kenyon, Barry Lopez, Willa Cather, David James Duncan. I read in these writers an artistic search for wholeness and transcendence that also lays full claim to our immersion in the created order, our ignorance, our dependence, our limits. Surely this is our primary task as artists of faith, as people of faith. Later, Norman and I are going to talk about perception as one of our prime needs, a way to perceive and begin to talk about the world that will get us thinking differently. The way we see the world has everything to do with how we treat it. If we see the atmosphere as a dumping ground for carbon, we'll treat it one way. An atmosphere is difficult to love. But what if we thought of our atmosphere as a womb? Think about that image for a moment. What if our atmosphere was a womb? What if the air and water and land were in fact our amniotic fluid? That changes things, doesn't it? Increasingly, I find myself turning to art as a sense-making enterprise. The remedy of our broken relationship with nature does not lie with the success or failure of the climate movement and all its breathless urgency. I think urgency cripples. I'm not saying that such movements need to disappear, only that our motivation to act must come from a deeper source, and that our work as artists and activists and pastors and gardeners and musicians must proceed on a different timeline. Just as God did not zap the world into being in one fell swoop, but proceeded slowly over 7 days, so too our work should follow a similar pace, which is the pace of art. And the best art proceeds as if it had all the time in the world. So now I'm ready to propose a thesis. You're thinking, it's about time. Here's my thesis. The more urgent our ecological crisis becomes, I think the more we need to slow our work down. The more urgent the ecological crisis becomes, the more we need to slow our work down and really think about what we're doing. The main problem, I don't think, is a warming climate. It's our frozen hearts, and no amount of data or urgency can thaw them. This is why we need art. We need Kafka's axe to break up the ice-locked seas within us. I need the Tallis scholars singing their beautiful Renaissance harmonies. Does anybody listen to the Tallis scholars? Yeah. Or Terrence Malick's film, The Tree of Life. I was weeping through that film. Man, what a powerful film. Or Per Peterson's novel, Out Stealing Horses, to name just several works of art that have moved me deeply. I need to daily touch plants and soil and running water. I need daily to be reminded of what's worth saving. And to be reminded, I need those non-mechanistic metaphors that call forth life. So our creative work, whether that's planting a garden or writing a sermon, our work cannot follow the timeline of catastrophe. It must step outside of predicted outcomes, linear models, and even hoped-for results. Only such art can move the human will to change and be changed, and then act. And now I return to our creationist friend, Ken Ham, because this is where the ark metaphor comes into its own. And I want to sort of reappropriate Ken Ham's ark for my own purposes here. Noah, you'll remember, was a man of the soil, the first to plant a vineyard, Genesis tells us, and his sons were Shem, Japheth, and Ham. From these, the whole earth was peopled. Mr. Ham's ark may not float, but other arks will, and we should give ourselves over to building them. Some of those arks will be artistic. Others will be ecological, actual ecological arks devoted to preserving endangered flora and fauna, even entire ecosystems. Community gardens and urban farms, like the Garfield Farm, are arks. They're havens where people can gather and flourish despite the climate change we are already facing. We need ecclesial arks too, or perhaps lifeboats, because I think the big ark of American Christianity seems to be capsizing, or at least heavily listing, and I'm not sure it will float again, at least not in its current form. But thousands of smaller boats will. Like Noah, I have 3 sons. We live on a hillside in western North Carolina. I too have planted a vineyard, though it's a bit scraggly right now. We have muscadine grapes, blueberries, Asian pears, asparagus. I hope that the tiny ark we are building for our sons, the fruit and vegetables, the nightly family meals, the books my wife and I read to them, the neighbors that we have conversation with, I hope that ark of love will nourish them and give them hope, even as our planetary impacts worsen. I hope we can leave our sons and daughters with more than a dying world. I hope our sons and daughters will take the best patterns of care we have to give and teach those patterns to their sons and daughters, and they to theirs. Whatever arks we build or sustain, our best work will result from adopting the pace of our Creator, a steady, unhurried pace. The sons and daughters of Noah are out there now, miles from the sea, clearing land and setting the first timbers, working as if they had all the time in the world. So that's my reflection on this overwhelming, difficult to understand issue. Thanks. Thank you. And I realize this is a difficult thing to even talk about. I've struggled for a good long while to even find these words to write about it, because climate change is such an overwhelming thing to conceive of. But I think we need to talk about it, and we have not really been talking about it in the church. Because I think, as Norman said earlier, we feel a sense of guilt. This is something we're all implicated in. There are no clear enemies. There's certainly groups of people and corporations that bear much greater responsibility for the harm than others. All of us bear far more responsibility, for example, than someone living in Bangladesh. And we feel that. I think we know that deep down. And so it's hard to even begin to speak of it without just sort of getting despondent. But there is hope, and there is this promise of a new heaven and a new earth that we've been talking about. And if we really believe that, then that brings a new opening to that conversation, right? We don't have to accept the conversation as it's progressed up until this point. There are always new ways to think about it and talk about it. And the church hasn't yet begun to own that prophetic stance. We haven't begun to bring that message of hope to the world. And so I'm curious to hear from you what thoughts you have on this. And so I want to take just a few minutes with your table, and I want you to just share. Have you been talking about this at all? Is this something that's a new conversation for you? What are the obstacles in your communities that you found? What are the silences that you've noticed? Has this become an elephant in the room in your congregation, in your community? I'm seeing some nods. And why? And what would it take to begin talking about it? What would it begin to break the silence? Because we can't just pretend it's not happening, right? We have to begin speaking about it. And I also want you to consider what metaphor comes to mind that helps you think about climate change. I mentioned one, this idea that the atmosphere is our womb. And I wonder if that resonates with people, if that gets you thinking of other metaphors, because it's too big to wrap our head around. That's why it's so great that we have the bread and the wine, this meal, as our central symbol of the Christian faith, right? I mean, who among us can really sit down and unpack Eucharistic theology other than Norman, right? I mean, it's some heady stuff, but we can all sit there and eat and share this common meal of the bread and the wine and be fed by Christ. And we can know that. So I think we need to begin thinking about climate change in metaphorical terms. At least that's my own suggestion.